besides that, I'm not actually here today to give you the sales pitch, but we are going to still be talking about true crime, as we've hinted. So we've obviously just learnt, everybody knows that true crime is a really popular category. It is across the world, particularly in Australia, but also a highly engaged one. And again, we just saw the results of that. But it's also a category, unlike many others, where we're talking about real people. You know, it's real stories, it's victims and their families, and also those accused of crimes and their families as well. So what we're going to discuss today is there a right way to do true crime podcasts? You know, is there a way to create and distribute true crime podcast content that's responsible? So considering not just those that might be featured in the content, but also for the listeners themselves. So quite a big question. I've got some of Australia's best true crime podcast content creators to help me answer it. Let me introduce them and you can wander on up. We've got Claire Harvey, editorial director of The Australian. Claire has commissioned some of Australia's most downloaded crime podcasts. You might know some of them: Hedley Thomas's The Teacher's Pet, The Night Driver, Shandy's Story and Shandy's Legacy, and the entire The Australian Crime Suite. Welcome, Claire. And we've got Jessica Lodge, senior news producer at Nine and creator of the award-winning Hannah's Story podcast. She partnered with Melissa Downs to share the story of Hannah Clark that captivated the nation. I think it was the anniversary of that last week. And the podcast is now being used as an education tool for DV experts and police across the country. Welcome, Jess. And Jack Laurence, former radio host, I'm sure you'll have many friends here of that, and creator and host of the award-winning podcast 1 Minute Remaining, Stories from the Inmates. So in this podcast, Jack talks to those convicted of crimes. He looks at their lives prior to incarceration, the cases against them, and their time behind bars. So Jack doesn't aim to prove anyone innocent or guilty. He simply allows them to tell their stories. He's also recently just started his second podcast project, Wanted. So welcome to the panel. Thank you. So for the first question, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, so obviously we've just seen a session that is very centred around brands, but a big part of that is obviously the engagement of true crime. So we've obviously just learned that there's no risk for brands that want to advertise in it, but some argue that the consumption of true crime podcast content is making us, as in the audience, the listeners, a bit more fearful and less trusting, like as a species or as a community. And I think Richard just got everyone to confirm that there are no serial killers in the room. So maybe we're not serial killers, but this idea that if we're all consuming so much crime content that we're thinking that crime's all around us, you know. As producers of true crime content, what do you think about this? We might start with you, Jack, because obviously you were a true crime listener before you were a creator.
Yes. Well, for me personally, I mean, it's no surprise to say that I don't fit my own sort of genre that I've chosen when it comes to listenership. But as I did put it to my own listeners, because we've got a Facebook group with about 6,000 of our hardcore 1 minute remainingers, and said to them, like, do you listen to true crime? Do you find yourself more fearful of the world around you because of it? And only 5% said that they did, whereas the rest... it was interesting. A lot of them said it was more educational in a way, which I found interesting, and it made them more aware as opposed to fearful, just more aware of their surroundings and their situations. A lot of people, not necessarily my podcast, because it's set in America, so their biggest fear is just getting arrested in America. But
got enough to worry about.
Yeah, but a lot of people, you know, with scammer podcasts and things like that, it's more sort of, you know, that awareness of this stuff goes on around the world, and just, you know, be careful.
Exactly, and I think we obviously just saw in the word cloud in the session before that it is that curiosity and problem solving. It is that mindset. Everyone thinks they're doing good by listening, which is interesting. Jess, what about you?
Yeah, I think... For me, it's two things. From true crime podcasts, you get connection and, again, education. And when you saw the words that came up on the screen before, there is this underlying desire for us to find out what drives people to do things. And that is what true crime answers or tries to. And so people are so curious. And a lot of the podcasts that have done well, it's because they dive into that how, why, and, you know, the deeper level of it. So there's the education around it. And, I mean, I think we saw in my podcast, if people aren't familiar, Hannah's Story was a domestic violence murder. It sort of dived into that case. the education that came out of it was the biggest thing. The conversation, all of the feedback was what people had learnt, and now they didn't run from what was an incredibly confronting story. They leaned right into it, to the point where you have police and schools and businesses incorporating that story, that really tough story, into education programs and police training and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I completely think it's the other way.
Yeah, it's incredible what it's inspired, I guess, you know, the channels, and we see that in true crime a lot, you know, additional media coming off the back of it. It's interesting what you said too about that mindset of wanting to find out why something could happen, because I guess it is that with these crimes that are so visceral, we're all trying to make sense of the world. So this idea that we do want to find out as much as we can to try and start answering these questions about why people could do this. And we don't always get there. Sometimes we do, if you're Claire Harvey and doing The Teacher's Pet. But we can at least start to try to, scratch that itch. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. So all of your roles involve covering content that is incredibly sensitive, both for you personally, you know, making this content, but also legally, as Claire knows. There's obviously a balance between maintaining respect while satisfying listener interest and telling a good story, again, as we saw in the research before. So how do you go about this? And I guess what is the media's responsibility when it comes to not only the victims, but those accused, and ensuring a fair legal process? I might start with you, Claire.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Thank you for having me, and congratulations to these guys for their extremely inspiring work. I think there's a great case that's round at the moment. Beau Lamar Condon, the New South Wales police officer who has been charged with the murders of two young Sydney men. We've seen that case play out in front of our eyes and between our ears, or on the outside of our ears, in the last 5 or 6 days, and we've been covering it on our daily news podcast, The Front, which I host. So newspapers have, hundreds of years of history of covering crime. And of course, a newspaper is, if you boil it down, an entertainment product. We have extremely lofty values of covering the news that's important, but there's no point covering it if nobody wants to read it. And so our job is to make the news important and relevant for audiences who need to know about what's going on in their communities. So, I think as journalists making true crime podcasts, we are, carrying on a heritage that is a central part of journalism. It's the same as the way we cover politics and kind of everything else. We have to be legally careful, of course. This case of Beau Lamar Condon is a fascinating example. So this man, who has not yet appeared before a court in any substantive way, but who has been charged with these two murders, has police standing up at press conferences every day, speaking about him as though he has already been convicted. There's only so many allegedlys you can throw into a podcast to avoid the very real, possibility that if you step over the line, he may not be able to get a fair trial. If something changes and he claims that he was fitted up by the police and he never told them where the bodies were and it's all not true, when that comes to court, we might be on the hook for the way we have reported this. We may be responsible for a conviction not being obtained. So that's something that's extremely, something we have to be incredibly careful about. On the other side, talking about the people who we are covering, of course, a podcast produced by a major publisher like us is going to affect people's lives. I just came here from a conversation with one of our journalists about someone who we are going to have to approach to talk about the fact that they're about to be a central character in a major investigative podcast. These are tough conversations. I think, I'm sure many of us in the room were extremely pleased about that research that we just saw for our own selfish purposes. But I liked it because I don't think true crime audiences are just into salacious details, or I don't think they're consuming it just as entertainment. A lot of our investigative podcasts cover, just like Jess's work, domestic and family violence, coercive relationships. That's what The Teacher's Pet was about. And I think in those instances, people are listening, maybe they've got a sister that they're worried about. Maybe they're reflecting on something that's happened in their own lives. I think there's those motivations are just as important as the people who just view it as entertainment.
Yeah. Jess and Jack, anything to add to that? Jack's obviously got a...
Yeah, well, I mean, I live in a very murky world of talking to people who've been convicted and, of some very heinous crimes. So I also sit in a very tricky world of making sure that, entertainment doesn't overtake and, there's victims out there and, we're well and truly, I'm the one and a person on the show. But, I'm well and truly aware of the fact there's victims out there. And I think the reason I started this show wasn't to go into the gory details of said crimes, which we don't. We actively avoid going into those details because I'm aware that there's people out there that are victims. But it's more, again, that educational factor for my show when it comes to the other side of the legal proceedings when, and again, I deal with America, which is a completely different kettle of fish altogether. But, in that particular realm, there is a lot of instances where, just because police are saying something happened, it doesn't mean it actually happened. And, there's a case I'm dealing with at the moment where a gentleman was accused of a heinous crime, and before he was even spoken to by police, you've got the media doing a sort of broadcast about the fact that we're searching for this young girl, and at the very end they sort of say, what about the father? I said, well, this is his story, and at the moment he's sticking to it. It's just like, and that's where you've got to go, guys, come on. It is a murky world that we sort of live in, but I think, as we've, again, the research shows, it's not about just the entertainment of blood and gore and that sort of things. It's an educational factor and it's, awareness and all that stuff that goes with it.
And I guess it's, and to Claire's point too, everyone is aware of the role the media can play and that the role it does have in Australians' lives. I guess it's up to the publisher how they choose to either take advantage of that or not. And I guess, both Claire and Jess are obviously journalists yourself. Podcasting is one channel, but this is something you would need to do across all channels. And if anything, I imagine that the podcast format is potentially easier as you do have more of that time to actually put together a good story and be able to research perhaps a little bit faster than what you're able to across some other channels. Jess, do you have...
Yeah, I think it comes back to the question you asked at the very beginning, is there a way to do it right? And there is. And respect is, at the centre of it. That's something that I kept in mind from the very beginning, my very first meeting with Hannah's parents. It was all around what they wanted, how they felt, what they needed. Otherwise, there was no point because they were the ones telling their story. And you respect the people in the story, but you also respect the audience by giving them the quality of journalism that it deserves. And then the audience responds to that quality of storytelling. And so it all ties in together, but it starts 100% with quality journalism and respect.
It's an interesting topic. Could be another panel, but there's a lot of the more, I guess, gory podcasts out there or salacious podcasts. And not only are, I guess, they, being lazy, you could say, in how they try and scratch that true crime itch, and potentially it's not what the audience wants. But perhaps more worryingly, oftentimes those podcasts, the creators are not journalists, they have no experience in this area and they're just ripping off Wikipedia pages or articles they read online. I guess that's actually a good segue to our next question, which is what does the future of true crime podcasting look like and how is it going to evolve as channels do and ecosystems?
Yeah, I think there's some of the world's most successful podcasts and successful news websites are just aggregators. They just take content created by other journalists who are out there talking to people and repackage it. Sometimes it's really annoying and you have to respect them for their great job in repackaging something that we've done. We're always annoyed at the Australian by the Daily Mail because by the time we wake up in the morning, they've ripped off all our yarns and often they have told them better than we did, and the lesson to us is let's learn from them. They got the headline better, they did the video better, they got the angle better, so let's learn something rather than raging at the computer, of course, which we all do. And the reason we're annoyed is that it costs us a fortune to make good journalism. We pay lawyers a fortune, we have to pay our journalists actually a pittance, but you know what I mean. No, I'm only joking. So I think I'm hoping that the future of podcasting involves less aggregation and more real journalism. I think every journalist has had an experience of doing a story quickly in a newsroom about something that you don't necessarily know too much about. You're under pressure for a deadline, and then you have the incredibly sobering moment of having to speak to someone who you've written about or going to the scene of the crime and talking to the detective whose work you might have criticised. You know, there is nothing like being out there in front of people to make you more responsible. That's my concern about aggregator podcasts that just talk about crimes as if they are
Not close
an
enough.
episode of maths. You know, it's they're not exposed to the human emotion that they're tapping into. So yeah, I really hope that that audiences tire of that content. The people I know already have, and lean more towards original investigative or deeply thoughtful interview-based work instead.
And I think the results from the prior session obviously spoke to that, and Jess's point that this is what the audience wants, so hopefully we can look forward to more original quality journalism in crime podcasts. I think we've run out of time, or am I doing... One more question. Okay, well, I might do a bit of a chicken or the egg. So in our newscast, we talk a lot about gateway podcasts. So this is the first podcast that popped your cherry in it, maybe that you listened to, and then it got you to love the channel. Everybody has one. And for a lot of people, it was Serial when it comes to crime, or The Teacher's Pet, locally here in Australia. So I guess chicken or egg, was it the success of a podcast like Serial that obviously was many people's first introduction to podcasting that has made true crime as a podcast genre so popular? Or do we think there's something more enduring about true crime content in podcast format that has, I guess, been so popular the last decade and has continued to stand?
I mean, there's no denying Serial's had a huge impact on the crimes genre, but I think it was more the way in which that show was put together. It was, very much groundbreaking, sort of, that audio documentary style of podcast that, really drew people in, speaking to an inmate in prison, and building that narrative. And I think it moved away from what we talk about, though. There's a podcast that literally just reads straight off Wikipedia as opposed to the more investigative journalism, the actual deep dives, the reading transcripts, the speaking to people that are involved in the situation. So I think Serial definitely has a big hold on the crime podcast and a lot to. It really pushed that genre forward. I mean, true crime's been around for forever and a day. I mean, books and all the rest of it. But I think when it came to the podcast sphere, I think Serial definitely. I mean, it was definitely an inspiration for my style of podcasting that I do. That's the way I like to build podcasts, and it was definitely an inspiration from that particular show. That's for sure.
It's a good point, because obviously, true crime absolutely spans genres and has done since the dawn of time. Yeah. I guess it does seem to be particularly pronounced in the podcast format. Anyone?
The interesting thing about Serial was how well they brought it home to land. Like everyone else, I was inspired by Serial, and a colleague, I was at the Sunday Telly at the time, having a break from the Australian, and a colleague and I, Yoni Bashan, started our own podcast just completely, I'll say inspired by, but, ripping off Serial's format.
You did the Daily
like, what can we
Mail
do? Let's go and do
version.
it. Two women murdered in the eastern suburbs of Sydney by, they were best friends, their husbands were best friends. One husband was the alibi for the other husband for one of the murders, and those crimes are both unsolved. So Yoni and I, were charging around the eastern suburbs doing this story, and then we ran out of steam after, I think, 5 episodes. We didn't have a conclusion. We didn't get a conviction. We kind of didn't get anything. And it taught me a really valuable lesson, which is that you need an end point in mind. You need a goal. Hedley Thomas always says your goal is to get someone put in jail, which is scary and hard. And, I'm still pretty embarrassed. It's called The Alibi, if you want to go and listen to it. And you can, if you know anything about that case, give me a call, because we really need another episode.
That's why I chose talking to inmates, because we know the ending. It's already there.
Yeah.
Jess, anything from you on that?
I think Serial is obviously, everything that's been said so far, but I think what it did, it showed how podcasting can reach the audience one-on-one, where, true crime does so well, documentaries and all the other mediums, but it was the first time that people were sitting there by themselves being told a really personal, fascinating story one-on-one. It cuts straight to the audience, which comes back to the advertising, which is why it's right there. It's so emotional and gripping. The audience is vulnerable. They're connected to it. Like, it's fascinating to me that people don't invest in true crime in that way, because it's the connection is already there, built by the content, and Serial showed that and paved the way for all the rest of us to show that you can just have this direct conversation with another person telling an incredibly important story.
We totally agree. I mean, the benefit of podcasting is obviously it's very intentional. You know, you click into it and you want to hear what you're pressing play on, and then true crime adds another layer of, I guess, engagement and being gripped to that. Definitely. We might be out of time now, but thank you so much to the panel.